My guest today has written the first major biography of Constance Baker Motley. Born to a blue-collar family during the Great Depression, Constance Baker Motley was expected to become a hairdresser, but instead she became the first Black woman to argue a case in front of the Supreme Court, the only Black female member in the legal team that defended Martin Luther King Jr. in Birmingham, the first Black woman elected to the state Senate in New York, and the first Black woman federal court judge. The story of this trailblazing attorney, activist, and judge is recounted in a new book, The Civil Rights Queen, Constance Baker Motley and the Struggle for Equality. And the author, Professor Tomiko Brown-Nagin, joins me, coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Good morning and welcome, Professor Brown-Nagin.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, I know you are both a legal and civil rights historian. You're a professor at Harvard Law School. You're also a dean at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. So you've got a lot on your plate, but yet you found time to write this incredible book about the beloved Constance Baker Motley. First of all, I just want to ask you, how did you find the time to do this extensive research to write such an amazing book, given all of the duties that you have at Harvard?
Yes, well, that I was able to do that really reflects my determination to get the book done, because I am so passionate about letting the world know about this remarkable woman who did such remarkable things. And so I did a lot of the research and writing before I became dean of Harvard Radcliffe Institute. And then I had to do a bit more over the past several years. And I'm just so thrilled to have the book out in the world now.
Well, it's gotten just incredible reviews. I was, looking through all the information that's on the internet about the book and looking at some of the folks that have weighed in, and just incredible comments about how well researched the book is, and just how you reveal for the first time information about Justice Motley that hadn't been revealed to the world. And I'm thinking about how perfect the timing is of this book, since we are now on the verge of getting the first Black woman appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. I can't imagine that you knew that this was going to happen as you were writing this book, but how does it feel to have the book out into the world at this moment?
Well, I did not know, I could not have known, but it is terrific that the book landed at this moment in our history when, as you say, it appears that a Black woman will be nominated to the Supreme Court. It has been a long time coming. As I reveal in my book, Motley was on short lists for the Supreme Court during the late 1960s and 1970s. She didn't get the nod, and I'm happy to reflect on why that might have been, because some of it relates to issues that I think are so relevant today.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely talk about her and what the prospects were for her during the 60s and 70s to be appointed to the Supreme Court. But I want to ask you, having researched her and gotten to know her on a level that many of us will never have an opportunity to do, what do you think this moment would mean for Judge Motley Baker?
Yes, well, I am certain that Judge Motley would just be thrilled. She would be bursting with pride that an eminently qualified African-American woman would take a seat on the bench. You know, she was very supportive of the appointment of women and people of color judges, because she said it strengthens American institutions. It shows that our institutions are fair, and validates all of the work that she did to make it clear in this country that equal opportunity is available to all.
So the title of the book, Civil Rights Queen. So we use the word queen a lot today in our vernacular. We call each other as Black women queens. How did you get to that title, Civil Rights Queen?
Sure. I came upon an article where a journalist, a reporter in the 1960s dubbed Motley, the civil rights queen. And I thought, well, that really captures it. And it captures her because it evokes the sense of being a warrior for justice. It recognizes her gender, which was so important to what she symbolized, the opportunity that she symbolized. And yet there's also a bit about that that I hope reflects the difficulty of being a symbol and even the substance of moving through the world that she did with so much power and authority, but always with her race and her gender shadowing her to some extent.
You share in the book a lot about her childhood and how her childhood influenced her in her later life. Can you tell us a little about what you learned researching her family and what it was like for her growing up in the Depression?
Right. She was born in 1921 in New Haven, Connecticut, to a family who had immigrated from Nevis in the West Indies. And the family was culturally conservative, very clear that they, as West Indians, I should really point to her father, thought that Nevisians and West Indians were superior to African Americans, which is ironic. I say that either because of or in spite of her father's teachings, Constance Baker Motley became a civil rights lawyer working on behalf of those same people. The father embraced traditional gender roles. He was a chef for various houses at Yale University. All of her male relatives worked at Yale University. And a point that I make that is vital to know is that her father read the privilege of the young white men who were his charges into himself. And it is both in some ways curious to modern ears, but it also was helpful it was protective of her, that sense of superiority. And so when she went to Jackson, Mississippi in 1951 and encountered a white male lawyer who didn't even want to shake her hand, she was bewildered by it because her mindset was, look, I don't know where you went to law school, but I graduated from Columbia Law School. Right. I'm from the Bakers of New Haven and Nevis. And so it was a protective shield for her.
Wow. And I know you said her father believed in these traditional gender roles, and she in some ways defied her father's expectations about what she would do with her career. How difficult was that given the strong figure that her father was in her life?
Yes, well, she was very candid about, in various oral history interviews, that although she certainly appreciated her parents and she talked a lot about how hardworking her father was, it was clear that, she said she didn't want to marry a man like her father who was so traditional in terms of gender. And she defied both her parents and really everyone who told her when she revealed her aspiration to be a lawyer that women don't get anywhere in the law. That's sort of a silly aspiration, and sillier still for a working class Black girl growing up in New Haven.
And in some ways, what she experienced coming out of law school was exactly what her parents had warned her about, because in that period when she did graduate, there weren't many jobs for female lawyers, particularly African-American female lawyers. So how difficult was it for the judge to make her entry into the legal profession after graduating, as you said, from an Ivy League law school like Columbia?
Yes, it's a very important part of the story to note. It is a story that could be told by many women who went on to achieve great things in the law, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Sandra Day O'Connor, Pauli Murray, you name them. She couldn't get a job in a New York City private law firm, which is the most lucrative sector of the legal profession. She recounts how she went for a job interview, and essentially the white male partner closed the door in her face. Mm-hmm. And yet the wonderful thing is Thurgood Marshall did not. He hired her on the spot when she went to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in search of a job as an intern in 1945. And she remained with the Inc. Fund, as it's called, for 20 years.
Yeah, I find the relationship that Judge Motley had with Thurgood Marshall to be really an interesting story, because we learn a lot about him. We learn a lot about the workings of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, as well about the gender roles of that time that often, I think, get obscured, not talked about nearly enough. What did you find to be, perhaps something that the general public wouldn't know about that relationship between the judge and Thurgood Marshall, who then goes on to become the first African American on the Supreme Court?
Yes, well, he was her mentor. He was very supportive of her, but is as true in many mentor-mentee relationships, it was complicated, complicated by gender. For example, after she went to Mississippi to argue her first trial, which was on behalf of African-American school teachers who experienced pay disparity in Mississippi, she went back to the Inc. Fund and challenged Thurgood Marshall to raise her pay because she thought that she didn't have a proper title and she wasn't being paid what she should be paid. And so that illustrates that even in great organizations fighting for equity, there can be blind spots. And there were with respect to women and gender at this time. And it reflects, Areva, how far ahead of her time Motley was, that she was in that position, the only woman at the Inc. Fund for most of the 20 years that she was there, and that she had to take that stand, which she did. And there are other incidents that I can talk about. I do want to note that however much trouble she had at moments with Marshall, she always credited him with making her career, saying had it not been for Thurgood Marshall, no one ever would have heard of Constance Baker Motley.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting that they maintained such a positive relationship, especially since you reveal in the book that she was passed over. When he went to the Supreme Court, she thought and expected, I guess, to receive his job as the head of the agency, and she was passed over for a white man, Jack Greenberg. I'm thinking about if that had happened in these times, what the response would have been from Black Twitter, what the response would have been on social media. But she stayed. She didn't leave the Inc. Fund right away, even though she was passed over by Thurgood Marshall and his replacement was a white male.
Correct. And the story goes like this. Marshall was being appointed to the Second Circuit by President Kennedy. So his job was open. And there were many African-American lawyers, including Constance Baker Motley, who thought that they had earned the position to be head of the NAACP, but Marshall saw it otherwise, and he did select Jack Greenberg. And let me be clear, Jack Greenberg was a terrific lawyer and a complete ally of the civil rights movement, and yet Marshall left the Inc. Fund just 6 years after Brown versus Board of Education. And so there was concern by some about the signal it was sending to Black lawyers that the NAACP had not chosen a Black lawyer. Motley also thought it had to do with gender. He couldn't have imagined, she thought, a woman in that position at that time. It would have been extraordinarily progressive had he chosen Motley, because it is true that no other nonprofit organizations were headed by women at that time. And so she was given she was number two. And she worked with Greenberg and worked well with him. And during the rest of her career at the Inc. Fund, litigated amazing cases that killed Jim Crow, essentially.
Yeah, and she was the first Black woman lawyer to argue a case before the U.S. Supreme Court. I imagine that was recognized by Marshall, but as you're saying, during that period, the thought of having a woman to head a nonprofit was non-existent. I guess it wasn't happening. You didn't see women in those kinds of leadership roles. How do you think the decision, or how does she make that decision from being this litigator who's fighting these most significant civil rights cases to accepting, when she did, an appointment to the court? What was that transition like for her, going from lawyer to judge?
Mm-hmm. Well, in between, she was in New York City politics as Manhattan Borough president, and she agreed to stand first for a position in the New York Senate and then for Manhattan Borough president, because she was just such an attractive figure to so many people. And by the time the appointment to the bench came open, she certainly wanted it. She wanted it because it would and did validate her career, her standing as a lawyer, one of the most respected lawyers in America. It would validate the civil rights movement, and she thought that she had earned it. And also, there were many people inside and outside of the civil rights movement and the women's liberation movement who thought that having one of theirs on the bench would mean that their claims would be validated by the judiciary more often than not. And as I argue in the book, that sometimes was true, sometimes not true. There were a lot of factors surrounding what Motley could do in that role as a judge.
Did her dad, Professor, live long enough to see her incredible accomplishments?
Not the appointment to the bench. Her mother was there and was incredibly proud of her, as were all of her family members. She had a strong family, extended family with whom she kept in close contact throughout her life, with many in New Haven, New York, and in Nevis.
And so you talked earlier in the interview about the fact that she herself ended up on the short list for Supreme Court nomination, but was never actually nominated. How many times was she actually, if you were able to determine, considered for a potential position on the Supreme Court?
Well, it's hard to know. There were media reports that she was on the short list, including during Republican presidencies. Now, I will tell you, there is some strategic use of these short lists. So it's not, if you're not working with the presidential team, it's hard to know how seriously anyone is considered. And yet, that she was cited by the media and also promoted by the National Women's Political Caucus and others who are concerned about representation on the bench is significant. Happy to share some thoughts about factors that would have dimmed her prospects for being appointed.
Oh, absolutely. What did you discover about those?
Right. So I argue that being the civil rights queen was a double-edged sword. So when she was nominated to the judiciary, there were those who said that her experience was too narrow. There were those who said that she couldn't be fair, particularly in discrimination cases, which is just a remarkable argument. And yet it was made repeatedly against Motley, Bob Carter, all of the civil rights lawyers who were appointed to the bench at that time. There were those who cited her race and were concerned that to appoint not one, but two Black lawyers associated with the NAACP to the bench would be considered too political. And this was Motley and Marshall. And all of those arguments followed her once she was actually on the bench. And moreover, during the time that she was eligible for promotion, she was deciding cases, and many of those cases were controversial, including a case where she decided in favor of an incarcerated person who challenged solitary confinement as unconstitutional. She ruled in his favor, also awarded him money damages, and let me tell you, there were many people who were not happy about that, because in that instance, she did seem to be validating the movements out of which she came, and that was not good for her prospects for promotion. And yet it says something important about her that she did it anyway. She believed in it. She thought it was consistent with the law. And so she took a stand that what did not do her much good when it came time for promotion. Nevertheless, she did it.
Yeah, let's talk about when she was on the bench, because, Professor, I found it interesting that the way she was received by both white America and Black America, some thinking that she was too conservative and not supportive enough of the movement, and African Americans during this period, particularly in the 60s, the height of the civil rights movement, in the 70s, believing that she was not going far enough, that she was not sufficiently supportive of the movement. So do you think that's in some reasons why the legacy of the judge has not been shared as much? She's not a household name for many individuals in the way that some of the other civil rights leaders are.
Yeah. Well, I will say that generally people like to draw bright lines with us or against us. And so to the extent that she was a moderate person when she was on the bench, and I do believe that she was a liberal, but on the spectrum of liberals, she was more moderate, then sure, it may have impacted how she's been remembered up to now. It's also true, though, Areva, that there's an anonymity that goes with being appointed to the bench, to the lower court. In fact, the recent popularity of certain Supreme Court justices is recent. Mostly, people don't know who these justices are, much less the lower court judges are. She got a lot of that pushback around whether she was sufficiently progressive during her period in politics, which was also during the dawn of the Black Power, Black nationalist movement, where many young people wanted freedom now, and were not interested in allyship with white liberals, in contrast to Motley. So that's some of the reason, I think, but mostly I think it's that history and leadership in history has been coded male, and I was committed to correcting that, because Motley is invaluable, both for her tremendous impact, but also because she's an incredible role model.
No, and thank you for doing that. You're right, because so many of the leaders coming out of the civil rights movement that we do celebrate are, of course, men. And as we know, there were many women who were equally important to and played such a critical role to that movement, whose names often are forgotten. I do want to talk, though, about when she was on the bench and how that relates to the expectations that people have now about the Black woman that is likely to be appointed by the president and then confirmed to the Supreme Court. I think people have an expectation that this person, whoever, from this list of 7, 8, 10, however many incredibly talented women are on the real short list, but that whoever actually gets the job is going to some way carry out the agenda of particularly Black people, of Black women, of women in general, and of progressives. Is that the wrong way to be thinking about this nominee, particularly in light of what we see from a historical perspective as it relates to Judge Motley?
Terrific question. And what I will say is that it is so important to have this appointment, because it will symbolize the validation of the values behind the Civil Rights Act that Motley, Marshall, and so many other people fought for. And it also will validate a Black woman of high achievement, which we need to do. On the other hand, it's also true that there are constraints on what a judge can do, even a justice. There is a supermajority, conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court, and thus the new appointee will likely not be able to stand out in the sense of being decisive in the way that some liberals were during, say, the Warren Court era. And so I would caution putting too much weight on the representation that we are about to gain on the Supreme Court through the appointment of an African-American woman. And of course, we need to give people, in my view, room to maneuver. There are a lot of there's precedent that constrains the Supreme Court, and many of them still believe in it, and all sorts of ways in which the facts of cases themselves can constrain how a jurist thinks about and decides in a case. So there is not a perfect one-to-one relationship between the cases that will percolate up to the Supreme Court and whatever decision-making that movements and individuals might expect of this justice, which allows me to say that ultimately, all of us who believe in equality have to be in doing our parts. It takes the jurists, the politicians, people working every day, people in their professions that have nothing to do with race or sex. We need a full complement of people who are doing that work.
Yeah, I'm really worried. I'm worried that the expectations on this candidate, this nominee, are going to be so incredibly high. And people are going to expect her to be able to do things that aren't probably feasible given the constraints of the Supreme Court. So we've got to make sure that folks are moderating to the extent possible those expectations, because I'm just fearful that we've had such agenda shaping by this court that there's some expectation that this woman can come in and reshape the court in a way that we know is not feasible. I heard someone speaking about the one of the potential nominees saying that she has this amazing ability to reach across the aisle, and if she's on the court, she's probably going to be able to persuade 6 of the conservatives on the court to perhaps rule in her favor. And I'm thinking, oh my God, that is probably not ever going to happen or likely. And what a tremendous burden for someone to carry going into that position. Everyone expecting them to be able to change a 6-3 majority to somehow now it's a 5-4 court. We know that that's just not practical.
Right. And I do think it's important to educate people about how the Supreme Court works, people who are outside of the law. I will also emphasize that, depending on how long this individual stays on the court itself will change over time. So we don't know exactly how things will play out. And yet I do think this nomination has been a long time coming. It is wonderful to celebrate the appointment of this individual. She will be a person of tremendous achievement, and I'm happy that an African-American woman will join the Supreme Court at last.
Yeah, you mentioned the word achievement. One of the things we're hearing from naysayers, some Republicans, that this is somehow an affirmative action pick, that by Biden stating that he was going to select a Black woman, that automatically taints her appointment. Were any of those comments or those complaints railed against Motley when she was being appointed to the federal bench? Did anyone call her an affirmative action pick? And what would you say in response to those that would attempt to paint this superbly credentialed woman, whoever she may be, because we already know everyone on the list is superbly credentialed, as an affirmative action pick?
Well, that particular language was not used against Motley, including because she was appointed really before the era of affirmative action entered the lexicon. In terms of what I would say about some of those arguments being made, first of all, it is ordinary politics for presidents to leverage Supreme Court nominations for political benefit. And that is what happened in this case. Biden was fulfilling a campaign promise, and there's nothing unusual about that. He spoke explicitly in terms of race and gender. I don't know that he did the nominee any favor by doing that, because we know that many of these women will already have been defined in the workplace by their race and gender. So I'm not sure that was what I would have done had anyone asked me. Nevertheless, the reality is that these women are supremely qualified, much more qualified to do many jobs than any number of the people who were trying to take shots at them for political purposes. And that's all it is. There's so much political theater surrounding Supreme Court nominations. We know that this country is deeply divided politically. We know that there are certain racial scripts that are followed. And I would like to see us highlight not only those people who were playing games around this nomination, but those who were indicating that they would be happy, including Republicans, to support an African-American woman. It's important to get all of those voices out there and not allow those who are naysayers to gain advantage, political advantage from this.
Yeah, I think you said it really well when you said political theater, because that's exactly what we're seeing. We know that Ronald Reagan said he was going to appoint a woman to the Supreme Court, and he did when he appointed Sandra Day O'Connor. We know Donald Trump talked about appointing a woman to the Supreme Court as well, and he did, as we know. So this is not—
He had a list.
Precedented. Yes, he had a list. And so we've seen this done before, and we didn't hear those same cries that somehow those potential nominees or actual nominees were affirmative action nominees. I just want to end by asking you, what is the biggest takeaway you want readers to get about Judge Motley? I know there was some critique about her view of racism and her belief that racism was relegated to the South and it wasn't a problem in the North, although we know that not to be the case. But what is the main takeaway you want the reader to get from Civil Rights Queen?
Sure. I would say I want people to know Constance Baker Motley's name. I want them to say her name at the same time as they're saying the names of Martin Luther King Jr. and Thurgood Marshall, and to understand her tremendous impact. We need to know, both because it's historically accurate, but also because there are advantages to all people being aware of the full complement of activists and lawyers who participated in the civil rights movement. It is empowering to see oneself represented in history, and I am so eager to have that happen in the case of Constance Baker Motley. She's a role model. She is a tremendous historical figure of great impact, and happy to have that be out there in the world.
Thank you so much, Professor Tomiko Brown-Nagin. Her book is The Civil Rights Queen, Constance Baker Motley, and the Struggle for Equality. Good luck. I'm sure you're going to be all over the place talking about this. This is such an exciting time to be a Black woman, to be a Black female lawyer, and I'm sure to be a Black female lawyer teaching at a law school. I'm sure the law students are equally excited and enthusiastic about this moment in history.
Well, thank you, Areva. I have enjoyed talking to you and look forward to seeing you again soon and continuing to talk about this great moment.
Thanks so much to Professor Tomiko Brown-Nagin for writing the definitive book on Judge Constance Baker Motley. And thanks to you for joining us today. During Black History Month, it is so important that we acknowledge all of the pioneers that fought for the civil rights of African Americans and all Americans. And that means men and women. It's really quite shameful and pathetic in some ways that the women who fought for civil rights during the 50s, the 60s, and 70s, so many of them are just a footnote. They're not talked about in history books. Kids don't learn about them in school. We don't celebrate them during this month. So we need professors like Tomiko Brown-Nagin and other authors to bring these characters forth, to elevate their profiles, to share their accomplishments so that we all can celebrate these women and end some of this gender disparity that Judge Motley and others endured during the 60s and 70s. This is the 21st century. This is 2021. We should not be elevating men over women, and we definitely should not be minimizing the contributions of women like Constance Baker Motley and others who were so critical in fighting, in her case, using the court system to fight to break down those racial barriers that were stubbornly persistent throughout the 60s and 70s and so much of our history. Makes me a little angry that women are still fighting to be recognized in this day and age, but this is how we change that. We have shows like this. We talk to authors like Tomiko Brown-Nagin, and we talk about these incredible civil rights leaders. Now, some words to live by. The iconic civil rights leader and Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm famously said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. Yes, she said, bring a folding chair. And Constance Baker Motley must have gotten this memo because she brought a folding chair. She fought to make the table bigger. She even worked to buy the damn house and the table. She fought to break down barriers, not just along racial lines, but along gender lines. And women like me, who are lawyers, Black women lawyers, we have so much to be grateful for because of women like Judge Motley. She paved the way. She graduated from an Ivy League law school. She fought to get a job at some of those Wall Street law firms. And even though they didn't hire her, she went on to have an incredibly impressive career, breaking many barriers, becoming the first of so many, and then reaching back to mentor other women, other female lawyers, and to really use her life as a role model of what someone growing up in a middle class community can make of themselves and how they can too aspire to the highest heights in the legal profession. This trailblazer should not be an afterthought. She's a queen, she's a hero, and she deserves her place on the throne. And this month, we are celebrating Constance Baker Motley, not just today, but every day of this month, and she should be celebrated all year long. All right, y'all, I'm out. Be safe out there. Wear your mask. Don't forget to get your booster. And remember, we're all in this together.